Welcome back to the Science Unsettled discussion series. I'm Tricia Sheehan, holistic health coach with Wellness Warriors. Today we have part 2 with Dr. Reid Sheftall. I'm really honored to have him with us today, and hopefully you already caught part 1. The goal of this discussion series is to get past the politics and the sensationalism and really understand what's going on with the pandemic and beyond, because now we're moving past the pandemic, as we proved in part 1 of this series with Dr. Sheftall. So the world's forever changed now, and there's some very important insights we need to have moving forward. And Dr. Sheftall is going to walk us through some things to really consider and some important insights. So again, be sure to go back and watch part 1 to understand why the pandemic ended January 8th and what got us to that point. And before we dive into all this, Dr. Sheftall, can you just tell all the listeners about your educational background, what type of work you do today?
Okay, I was an undergrad at MIT where I majored in physics. I went to medical school after teaching physics for a year at a university and decided I wanted to be a doctor. And then I trained in general surgery and then plastic surgery. And right now I'm in the middle of training for, not in the middle, near the end of training for cardiothoracic surgery. I want to learn how to repair congenital malformations in children.
Wow, awesome. Very cool.
So I spend most of my time doing that, of course, but also I started a charity 20 years ago called Operation Kids. And it started out small, just me repairing burn injured children with acid and everything, which is a big problem over here where I live in Cambodia. But it's expanded to repairing congenital heart defects, decubitus ulcers, vision problems to restore sight. It just turned into this huge thing. So that's what I spend my time on.
Awesome. Very cool. All right. Well, we're going to get right into it. And I did ask Dr. Sheftall to prepare some slides so that we would have a visual to follow along with what he's talking about. So Dr. Sheftall, if you want to go ahead and pull those up, okay. we can dive into this.
Great.
And in part 1, while you're bringing those up, I'll just kind of recap for everyone. In part 1, you showed us a lot of data to prove that the experts really got it wrong during the pandemic regarding things like infection fatality rates and the effectiveness of lockdowns and masks, the timing of the vaccine, and some other things. So hopefully today we can talk a little bit about, is this something new for the experts to get it so wrong on something that's so profoundly influential on society, or what is happening with that?
Right. We're going to cover that. I addressed that in some of the slides.
Okay, perfect.
As we move toward the end of this, it becomes more and more philosophical about where society is going. And these early things are just examples of it. But anyway, yesterday, this is where we ended. I was talking about the epidemic turning into a thing we call endemic in society, which means it's still there. People will still get it, and even a few people will die from it, sadly. But we won't be able to eradicate it, like say we did smallpox.
Right.
And just to clarify, I talked about I think I have a slide coming up. I'll talk about it. I'll refer to that point when I see the slide that makes it easy to understand. But I was talking about lockdowns and masks never changing the shape of any curves. And recently a study at MIT showed even that their social distancing was overblown, and the 6 feet distance was totally arbitrary, which everybody knew. And they did studies that showed that being 6 feet away from someone or 60 feet if you're indoors is equivalent, which was even surprising to a lot of people. So let's go on to the first news slide of the day, where I show that 74 years of randomized controlled trials, which is the best way to analyze a medical intervention, prove that masks do not reduce respiratory transmitted diseases significantly. So just very quickly, this was on an NIH website, okay? And National Library of Medicine. So, you know, it's from a very credible source, supposedly. But let me just read a couple of these things. Over 72 years of literature now, looking at randomized controlled trials, although mechanistic studies support the potential effect of hand hygiene or face masks, meaning all those studies where they showed the gas coming out of the person's mouth when he had a mask on versus when he didn't. So that's a mechanistic study, and it supported the potential that it might help. Evidence from 14 randomized controlled trials of these measures did not support a substantial effect on transmission of laboratory confirmed influenza. That was one of the meta-analyses. Another one, the evidence from randomized controlled trials suggests that the use of face masks, either by infected persons or by uninfected persons, does not have a substantial effect on influenza transmission. And I could read 3 and 4, but let's skip it in the interest of time. People can go back and stop the video if they want, but every one of these says that masks don't do anything significant. And I was trying to explain the reason for that yesterday, and I did explain that the virus is very small. And if you've seen pictures of virus particles coming out of a cell that are all orange and the cell is blue, that's just a colorized electron micrograph. The viruses don't have color, and I explained why yesterday. Their wavelength at a diameter of 100 nanometers is too short to even be in the visible spectrum, part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay. So just a couple of data graphs from this year, just to bring the point home. We've got the randomized controlled trials that prove it. And here is the state of Connecticut, where at different times, different levels of mask mandates were instituted. This was for being indoors. This was for outside. And then they started fining people for not wearing masks. And I'll tell you, when you start fining people $200, they'll wear a mask just so they don't get fined. Right. And what happened to the cases when they started fining people for wearing masks so that the percent went way up? The cases shot up like a bullet. So the mask did not prevent the cases from spreading like crazy, really. Look at this. Okay. You can look at all the states, they're all the same. This is the entire United States. And this is the graph that I showed you yesterday. This is January 8th in here. And this is about where we are now. But I was quoting 23,000 yesterday because it was May 26th, the final number. And it was 23,000 during that day. But in the last 2 days, it was 12,000 one day and 8,000. It's gotten very, very low. And to put that in perspective, every year there are 50 million influenza cases reported, okay, documented and reported. And most people that get the flu don't go to the doctor where the case is documented. You know, when I get it, I just stay at home and treat it and lay in bed and watch TV. And 3 days later, I feel better, maybe a week later, but I don't go to the doctor. Most people don't. So if you assume that, say, 100 million people a year get the flu, and you divide that by 365, because that's the number of days in a year, you find that 273,000 people per day get the flu. So now we're down to 12,000 people getting COVID per day, and 273,000 get the flu per day. So that ought to give you an idea of how far this thing has fallen down. Right. It's now down more than 97% from its peak. So it's no longer in the epidemic range by any stretch of the imagination. Now, this graph I put in because it shows how mask usage, which went up very quickly in the United States, and by August it was 80% or so, has absolutely no correlation. The dots here are mask usage. And this is the graph of cases versus time. And there's no correlation there. You see that? Right. Okay. Now, I'd like to spend just a second being nice if I can, but it's hard sometimes, to call out some of the people that really attacked Governor Abbott when he decided to remove the mask mandates in Texas on March 8th. You had some very famous, influential people like Beto O'Rourke, who ran for president. He said, Abbott is killing the people of Texas. when he said that he was going to take away the mask mandate. Dr. Fauci said it is ill-advised and risky for Abbott to lift the mask mandates. President Biden said it's Neanderthal thinking. Governor Newsom said removing the mask mandate and opening up is absolutely reckless. And Dr. Reiner, who's pictured here, and I'll talk about that in a second, said lifting the mask mandate and allowing business to open is a gigantic mistake. Now, this was on March 8th, and it ended on January 8th, as I showed yesterday, without the help of the vaccines. So January 8th, January, February, March, 2 months after it was over, the graph was down to, it was more than 90% down from its peak. It wasn't even an epidemic anymore. And I've also showed you the randomized controlled trials that show that masks don't work. So these people are attacking the governor, and they were all wrong, obviously. And sometimes, you need to call out the people that are wrong. Everybody's afraid to speak up, but this kind of incorrect information gets out to society and causes a lot of damage.
Right.
This is the host of The Daily Show. I think his name is Trevor Noah. And he said, even as vaccines roll out, it's still important to mask up, keep our distance, and not do whatever the F Texas is doing. I know he's making a joke, but actually, the Governor DeSantis, Abbott, and the governor of Mississippi, I don't know his name, who removed the mask mandates fairly early. Now, dozens of states have removed them. But these guys removed them when they realized they weren't doing anything but causing problems. So I just wanted to point it out that a lot of these doctors and government officials who are in charge of governing us really never got this understanding down. Okay, now I just want to talk about lockdowns for a second. I know everybody knows about it now, but I think it was the stupidest public policy decision in the history of medicine. And let me just show you something here very quickly. I'm not talking about the economic damage yet, which I will in a second, or the medical damage caused by the lockdowns, just the lockdowns themselves, just putting people in the house to for the most part, to not go outside, certainly not go to work or anything. And the fatality rate was higher in the countries with longer lockdowns than it was in the countries with shorter lockdowns. So it wasn't just the economic damage and the medical damage as far as not letting people see doctors and stuff because they blocked hospital use for non-emergency surgery, things like that. Locking down people longer actually killed more people. And I explained why yesterday. What could be stupider than taking a college student who has no symptoms but does have the infection home and forcing him to lock down with grandma, who was very susceptible to it? Very, very ill thought out idea. But of course, we did have medical consequences, and we had 650,000 people undergoing chemotherapy at any given time, and half of them stopped their treatment. So how many people died because of that? 2/3 to 3/4 of cancer screenings, like colonoscopies, were not done last year. So if a polyp or an adeno-CA was removable with the colonoscope and it wasn't done, some of those people are going to die in a couple of years because it metastasized to the liver, for example. 40 to 50% of people with heart attacks did not even call an ambulance because they were afraid to go to the hospital, and so forth. 1/2 of US children did not go in for their vaccinations. We're going to talk about vaccinations a little bit, and I have a lot in videos. I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch, but there were a lot of problems with the vaccines this year, if you want to even call them that. And I'm going to talk about that a lot when we get to the philosophy of it. So let me just get through this quickly. People know a lot of this. Non-emergency surgery was discontinued. Suspicious breast lumps in women were not being biopsied because it wasn't an emergency. People lost their jobs. And as a mother, your children are the most important thing to you. So if you felt a breast lump and you had lost your job, which happened to a lot of people, as you know, you might choose to use the money to feed your children the limited money that's left, of course, and not check your breast lump. And of course, breast cancer is a disease that's very easy to cure if you catch it early, and very, very hard to cure if it's metastasized. So seeing the doctor as soon as possible is very important. But people had limited money. They had to feed their children or check out a breast lump. And most mothers will feed their children. That's a tragedy of it. Cardiovascular disease was being ignored. People weren't getting their high blood pressure and diabetes managed, on and on and on. And of course, ER visits for child abuse, serious child abuse, went up 35%. And remember, that was another problem with closing the schools. The schools are where a lot of problems are discovered, especially with child abuse to children. They come in with a black eye or something. Even things like someone like me, I didn't know I was nearsighted until I went to school and I couldn't see the blackboard, for example. And the teacher said, "Why are you sitting in the front row and you still can't read it?" That sort of thing. So closing of the schools caused lots of problems, more than people would think of automatically. And then, of course, economic consequences were overwhelming. 265 million people are facing acute food shortages as of October 10th. Imagine how bad it is now. 100 million people fell into the extreme poverty category, living on less than $1 a day. The WHO estimates that 140 million people will starve to death because of the economic fallout. Think about that. When only a few million have died from the disease. You see how much worse it is than the disease itself, probably 100 times worse.
Yeah.
All right, and political leaders are still using lockdowns despite all the data that has been in for many, many months that show that they don't benefit. I just showed you the curves. More people die in longer lockdowns, aside from the economic and medical damage. And of course, the economic and medical damage is 100-fold worse than the virus. So this thing, I just don't understand why they would still use these things. Now, the next topic is, how could they have gotten it so wrong? And by they, we're talking about the experts, the White House team, before and after Dr. Atlas, who I referred to yesterday, the WHO, the CDC, TV doctors, modelers, epidemiologists. How did they get it so wrong? Well, part of the problem was groupthink, what I call groupthink. Somebody early on made the calculation, a modeler, that the infection fatality rate was going to be about 4%. And people didn't think independently about that because he's a modeler, he's a famous modeler, he's done it many, many times, and he grossly overestimated everything. And that scared the population into agreeing to things like lockdowns, like I talked about yesterday. The other problem, how did this happen, is there is a refusal, and I'm going to talk about this a lot when we get to the philosophical part of tonight. There's a refusal to allow doctors who knew more than the experts about certain aspects of this, like the physics of it. You can't solve a nanoscopic problem with a macroscopic solution. You can't do it, okay? The gaps in the door, when you close the door, is like are so big compared to the size of the virus. 90 million viruses fit inside a BB. That's how small they are. They're so small, they're invisible, like I talked about. To a virus with a closed door or closed window, it's like throwing a tennis ball through a garage door. It just goes right in, okay? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, conflicts of interest, which I think really got to be a problem when the vaccines came out, and even early on, because you've got doctors that are coming on a network, let's say CNN or something, and they're saying all these things, which I found so many problems with and made videos about and proved them wrong. Those doctors are getting paid money to come on there. If they say something that doesn't fit the narrative, they're not going to be consulted anymore. And I think some of that happened. I don't know how much. And either they didn't understand it, they profoundly did not understand human immunology, or there was some conflict of interest pressure keeping them on the side of the CDC and some of the other places that were just getting it completely wrong all the time. Science has been co-opted by special interest groups I hate to say that, but it's been auctioned off to the highest bidder in some cases. There are some corporations and some big pharma that I'll talk about it specifically later that are really withholding some information the general public needs to hear about this. Now, another problem happened, and that's when I won't read this. Another problem happened, and that's when the general public started to believe the narratives. And there's a frailty of people, and I'm sure I'm subject to it too, but when there's a new concept, let's say the concept is flattening the curve, okay? And people hadn't heard that expression before. And once you're told what it means and how it works, you put people into lockdowns and fewer people get the disease per unit time. So the peak doesn't go as high and it doesn't overwhelm the hospital, because there's a point at which the hospitals get a little overwhelmed, right? Okay. So when people understand that, when they finally understand the concept of flattening the curve, even though it's poppycock, it didn't work and it wouldn't work, just them understanding it makes them feel good to understand something. And then they start explaining it to other people. Then they almost have a vested interest in it being true. They don't want to admit that it's utter nonsense after they've explained it to everybody. You understand? And that happens, no question about it. The other one is herd immunity. I mean, herd immunity, everyone knows what a herd of cattle is. But when they learn the concept of herd immunity, which again is not something you hear every day, but it's fairly easy to understand. You get a certain percentage of a herd having or being protected from something, and then the virus can't find vulnerable people and it dies out. Well, the same thing happened there. So they began to understand herd immunity, and then they started believing all these statements about herd immunity that were wrong. They had a vested interest in believing that also. And that happened too. We even had non-doctors on TV like Alison Camerata on CNN, who said that after they had measured a bunch of people in England and found that 6.5% had antibodies, and then 3 months later, they measured and found that 3.2% of the people had antibodies. And she said, well, that's the reason right there that proves natural immunity is not going to get us to herd immunity, or some silly thing like that. But she's on TV. Lots of people watch television. And of course, it really means that the prevalence went up, you see, and that's why the percentage dropped. Plus, antibodies are molecules and they have half-lives like anything. They can drop off to zero, but you still have clonal memory in you. You understand? You still have B cells that can make antibodies at the drop of a hat if another similar antigen comes into the body, and it knocks it off very quickly. That's the whole principle behind vaccinations. Mm-hmm. See what I mean? But people misunderstanding these simple things. Well, they understand the first simple thing, and then they extrapolate and get confident that they understand it, and they start speaking strangely crazy things that people listen to. Yeah. The doctors even saying that there were 90% of the population was vulnerable, way up in October or something. Yesterday, I proved 155 million people had already gotten exposed in September, almost half of the whole country. And they're saying 90% are still vulnerable. And they were not even counting immunity in place. So they were so far off, it was scary. And these are doctors that were doing this. Okay. Then, of course, the same thing happened before COVID with climate change. People sort of understand the greenhouse effect, how certain molecules can trap heat on the earth. So they get a little bit of an understanding of that. And they've been in greenhouses before, and they know they're very hot compared to outside. So they sort of know that's possible. And it happens on Venus. Is it going to happen on Earth? So they get the idea. And then they start believing people who are calling CO2 a poison. Now, CO2 is not a poison. CO2 is necessary for life. If it drops too low in the atmosphere, the plants die, because plants need it for photosynthesis, which is a process where they use light, CO2, and water to make sugars so they can live through the dormant period and then grow again in the spring, right? But when I watch the Democratic debate, and of course the left is more guilty than the right, but they're both guilty in some ways. But when I watched the presidential debate last year or a town hall, excuse me, on climate change, they all referred to CO2 as either a poison or, what was the other word they used? Toxic. They either said it was toxic or a poison. Wow, that's amazing, because a lot of people hear that and think there's something really bad about CO2. When you look at the percent of the atmosphere that's CO2, it's tiny. And then, of course, watching CNBC when Governor Cuomo came on and the initial data came back from COVID, it showed that the essential workers were getting hospitalized less often than the lockdown people. Exactly the opposite of what they were doing the lockdown for. And it made sense to me because the people stuck in the house with grandma and junior who had it at college and so forth weren't going outside and getting enough sun and having their vitamin D levels at the right protective level. So it was amazing because he was actually on CNBC when the data was put up on the thing. I've got a slide of it here. Let me just quickly go to it. Yeah, here it is. Here's Governor Cuomo. And he's got "Stay home, stop the spread, save lives" as the tagline. And these were the initial findings of what the lockdowns were doing. The people who were not working were going to the hospital more often. The people who were not traveling were going to the hospital more often. It was predominantly minority, and there were reasons for that. It was older people. We know that now, right? It was people who were staying at home. It was non-essential employees that were staying at home. Those were the ones that were going to the hospital with it. So everything was wrong. Okay, topic 3, was the COVID experience something new, the so-called experts being so wrong at every turn? No, this is not new at all. There is a branch of philosophy that you hear every once in a while. It's called postmodernism. And it's a branch that believes that there are no absolute truths and it rejects reason, okay? For example, since there are no objective truths, you're allowed to say, as a 6'3", 210-pound Caucasian male, predominantly, I'm Spanish and white, okay, mixed, that I can say that I'm a 5-foot-tall Asian female. It's okay for me to say that and believe it, and everyone should believe it and treat me like that. That's a postmodernist idea where there's no absolute truths, okay? It rejects reason. And there was a lot of that even before COVID, if you remember. Somebody was saying there were 63 genders. You know, things like that were out there. And there were people that really believe it. And different people will go around and interview college-age kids on the campus, and they will believe that you're allowed to be what you say you are. Mm-hmm. Not just pretend or fantasize about it, but that's who you are, according to them. So it's really a problem. And it was there before COVID. You know, certainly climate change has a little bit of that. And let me talk about that for a second. The IPCC scientists were in a way replaced by the TV and government doctors. When the general public stopped believing in the climate change narrative because none of it was coming true. People were saying there were going to be no polar ice caps in 2005. You know, it's 16 years later and the polar ice caps are still there. That was going on for probably about 20 years. I think it began in the 90s or maybe late 80s even. All these predictions about New York flooding and the ice caps disappearing and so forth. So when people started saying, hey, come on, you know, you're wrong on everything, we've had enough of this, you know, that's when COVID came around and sort of took over. But COVID is, like I said, there's 273,000 flu cases per day. And we've got 12,000 COVID now per day as of a day. I think it was yesterday, someone said it. So COVID is going to fall out of the news, or it's going to be all these crazy restrictions are going to be rejected because people aren't going to put up with it anymore when the flu is 20 times bigger per day now. And they're probably going to go back to climate change a little bit. And the big problem with climate change was that the models were so inaccurate, they couldn't even predict the past when they knew what the data was. The models can't even predict the past. That's scary. Let alone the future. You know what I mean? Okay, and I'll give you a couple details about that in a second. I'm just giving you another example of what I'm going to talk about generally in the philosophy later. So prepare for climate change coming back as COVID reaches the endemic stage, which it's already reached. It's already gone below the epidemic stage. And I just wanted to say, there aren't any climate change deniers. Everybody agrees that the climate is changing and has always changed, okay? There's a disagreement, however, a good disagreement, a debatable disagreement between two groups. One group thinks that CO2, man-made CO2, is the primary driver of global warming through the greenhouse effect, okay? And the other group does not believe that. The people in the former group are, you know, Al Gore, the politicians, generally people on the left, those who want to eliminate fossil fuel use and replace it with the Green New Deal, that type of people are in group one. The people who referred to CO2 as toxic or a poison gas believe that. The other group, which is generally composed of physicists, rejects it. And one of the reasons they reject it is the graphs of the increase in CO2, which has been enormous, have not correlated with an increase in temperature. The temperature has gone up about 1 degree centigrade in the last 100 years. And the CO2 has gone really high, you know, way more than double, you know? So there's tons of data that shows that there's poor correlation there. CO2 does a lot of really good things, actually. It reduces the water requirement of plants. And a lot of people think that sounds strange when I say that, but the reason is CO2 does not come in through the roots into the plant. It comes in through little pores in the leaves and everything. So when the CO2 is very low, when it's very low, more water is lost by the plant because the plant has to upregulate the little pores in its leaves and so forth to get enough CO2 in to make sugar, right, through photosynthesis. And the more holes that are there to try to get more CO2 in, the more water evaporates out of them. So you actually need more water when the CO2 is low. You follow that? Okay.
Yep.
So it does, and you know, water is very important. So that's one way in which having a lot of CO2 actually helps feeding people and preserving water and so forth. Okay. The other problem with the consensus group, in my eyes, is that they make statements sometimes that to a scientific person are almost laughable, like the science is settled, or 97% of some group agree on something. Science is not something that people vote on. If it was, Copernicus would have never showed us that the Earth goes around the sun instead of the sun going around the Earth, for example. Or Galileo had the same problem earlier. So there's no voting on science. You have to prove your point, test it, make a hypothesis, test it with experiments, and so forth. And of course, the science is never settled. And let me get into the philosophy here just a little bit, because I've given you a couple of examples of where things have gone awry as far as science is concerned. And I want to show you why and show you how it was done, kind of how it was auctioned off to the highest bidder. There's a word that's hard to pronounce. I've never heard it spoken, but I read it. So I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but the word is obscurantism. And it sort of means what it is, what it says. It's the opposition to the spread of knowledge, a policy of withholding knowledge from the general public. Okay? The practice of deliberately preventing the facts or full details of something from becoming known. And good examples of this would be the mainstream media not inviting serious, credentialed people onto debate lockdowns, mask use, causes of climate change. The people in the group that believe that CO2 is the major driver, they won't show up to any debates. They won't debate the physicists on it. They call for these debates, they get invited, and the physicists show up, 3 of them sitting in a chair, and the other side's empty. They won't even come. Very upsetting, because you have to debate this stuff. You have to prove your position. So that's an example. 63 genders. That should be debated. That can cause a lot of problems down the road when we have to identify ourselves and so forth. Not just bathroom use, but prisons. Should someone be able to say, I'm a woman who's a man who was convicted for rape and is in a male prison, should he be allowed to go stay in a female prison? Now, I didn't just make that up. That happened recently, and the guy raped 2 women. This is serious stuff. We have to stick to reality here. And there's many, many examples. Now, here's how it's applied in a way that slips by the public's scrutiny. Statements are made about, let's say, the causes of global warming that support a narrative that is very beneficial to some groups, like a group that wants to sell windmills or something, okay? And extract wind power because it's clean. And I say that in quotes. I'll tell you why it's not so clean in a second. But the reasoning doesn't seem right to some people who sort of look at the whole picture, kind of like the lockdown, like me when I knew that lockdowns wouldn't work. And I'm going, y'all aren't even considering the bad fallout from this. This is going to kill a lot of people. Okay. So let's stick with climate change for just a second. So somebody has a narrative that is beneficial to them, and scientists will put out papers that talk about how much energy windmills can produce from the wind. And it sounds good when you read it first, but then you start thinking, well, what about all the fossil fuel that's used to create and transport the concrete at the base of every windmill that you build? What about the steel that the windmill is made out of? What are you going to do with all the blades when they finish their active life and you have to bury them in a landfill? Those blades are enormous. Those things need to be considered when you do a cost benefit analysis. And I'm talking about cost to the environment, not just money, before you think that windmills are a good idea. I don't know if you know this, but you got to clear a lot of land to put windmills 500 meters apart. If they're too close, it distorts the airflow, and the next blades won't pick up as much energy from it. You understand? So they have to be very far apart. And you have to cut down trees sometimes to put them out, or you have to put them in deserts. And there's ecosystems in deserts that get destroyed by windmills. So that's just one tiny example, but you see where I'm getting with this? The scientists will put out data that makes windmills look good because the company that benefits from windmills is funding the scientists. You see? So that's what I mean when I say that science has been co-opted or auctioned off to the highest bidder. These academics in the universities will lose their funding if they don't put out papers that stick to the narrative. And they certainly are not allowed to put out anything that goes against the narrative. They'd be taken off the dole immediately, which is horrible, isn't it? I mean, for science and for civilization, if that sort of thing is going on. Even, you may not remember this, or you may, back somewhere along the sort of the early part of the climate change debate, a group of scientists in Great Britain were caught fabricating results. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about COVID a little bit. Let me give you an example of this from the world of COVID. There is a medicine called ivermectin that is a anti-parasitic drug, but it has tremendous antiviral properties. And we first knew that this thing had potential when we looked at it in vitro. That means in a petri dish or in a test tube, not in a person, not in human beings. That would be in vivo. But it was just phenomenal in vitro. So people did a lot of studies on it, and it turned out to be spectacularly effective in people too. It's very, very cheap. It reduces mortality by 80% in dozens of randomized controlled trials. Dozens. Now, when you reduce mortality by 80%, That is an enormous number. That means if 500,000 people died and you reduce it by 80%, you're down to 100,000. So you save 400,000 lives, okay, with the use of this medicine at the proper time. This information has, for the most part, been withheld from the public. There was a lot of fighting about hydroxychloroquine when President Trump endorsed it. You know, there were a lot of political reasons to make him look silly and wrong and everything. And there are some financial reasons to keep ivermectin out of the public consciousness. And one of them is that if you have a medicine, a treatment that is effective, emergency use authorizations are not granted. Because remember, the FDA has not approved the vaccines yet. They only have an emergency use authorization,
right,
which will be given by the FDA in a case where people are dying and we have to try everything kind of and so they'll give emergency use authorizations. But if there's an effective treatment, they won't jump right in and approve something for emergency use because there's a very effective treatment that exists. And that could be, I'll say, I don't have proof of it, certainly. I'm just thinking out loud almost. That could be the reason why ivermectin's effectiveness has been held back from the United States and the world, okay? It's very, very cheap. I mean, even the WHO has put out memoranda on ivermectin that say it's not proven and it's dangerous or something like that. I don't know about if they've said dangerous. I know they said it about hydroxychloroquine, that it was dangerous. And the TB doctors did too. I could list the names. But hydroxychloroquine is also called Plaquenil. That's the trade name of it. And it's used for rheumatoid arthritis. People take it for 40 years. It's also used for systemic lupus erythematosus, another autoimmune disease that goes on your whole life. And also, hydroxychloroquine is a prophylactic against malaria. So they're not going to give a prophylactic that's dangerous to people who haven't even gotten the disease yet, just to protect them. You see what I mean? It wouldn't make any sense, really. All right. So that's an example of obscurantism. In other words, they're opposing the spread of knowledge. They're withholding knowledge from the general public. They're deliberately preventing the facts or full details of something from becoming known. That's exactly what it is. And that is a very, very dangerous philosophy that is spreading over the entire world, really. That the person with the purse strings is not allowing the public to hear the facts about something that could be life-saving. Very, very bad, right?
Right.
Now, do we generally see this happening in society? Yes. Narratives are being pushed by small but very vocal groups with an agenda, right? And narratives that the extreme majority of people don't believe deep down in their heart, if you know what I mean. And they will punish the people that don't toe the line. I alluded to that a little bit yesterday. And just to give you an example of this that everyone knows about, I'm going to talk about race problems that we've had, which is a tragedy to me. Last summer was very sad to see so much destruction of minority neighborhoods by minorities and things like that. It was very upsetting. Every once in a while, they'd show a video of a man who built a business over 40 years and it was destroyed, and it's just horrible. But BLM was founded on the hands up, don't shoot story, right, of Michael Brown and Ferguson. And the story came from his friend there. I forgot his friend's name, I'm sorry. But all of the people who testified in the grand jury said that is not what happened. He did not say that. He didn't hold up his hands and say, don't shoot. But they gave birth to the BLM movement over that. So let's say you're a man who owns a small business in an area where there's going to be some rioting, you know, an African-American man. And you may not believe, you may know that that was fabricated, you know, you may know that. So you're gonna write BLM in your window so that they don't break your window and steal and destroy your business. So they're asking you to believe something that you don't really believe and to endorse it. And that's very dangerous. That's what being a good Soviet citizen was all about, or something, if you know what I mean. The Soviets used it to demoralize the population, to make them advocate for things that they didn't believe themselves. You understand? It just destroys it demoralizes you. I think that's a pretty good word. So if you do if that gentleman had expressed an opinion that refuted the narrative, the hands up, don't shoot narrative. I'm talking about the black gentleman who owns a business, and used very logical reasoning, like the black witnesses in Ferguson said that it did not happen. It wasn't a racial thing. They just said he didn't stick his hands up and say, don't shoot. Then he would be even more severely punished. The more logical and reasoned his argument, he'd be punished even more. And that's, of course, a horrible thing. And it's infiltrated just about every aspect of society now. All this virtue signaling and oppression Olympics and many, many things, which I think I talk about a little bit later. Let me use another everyday example. Again, it's a racial example, and I'm not obsessed with it. I just think that's something that a lot of people know about, because it's something that everybody's concerned about now. You know, there's no reason for all this racism. I mean, or all this purported racism that I really don't think exists very much between people. You know, the news media really drives that narrative a lot. If they show videos of horrible things. But another example would be the defund the police movement. 88% of Black people are against defunding the movement. They suffer greatly when there's fewer policemen protecting them. The Chauvin Floyd trial is an example of it. The narrative that police kill unarmed Blacks disproportionately, believe it or not, that is not supported by the data. I have looked into this so much because I'd be so against it if it were true. I'd be out on the street every day. But in 2019, for example, we had 9 Black men that were killed unarmed by police and 19 white young men that were killed unarmed. And at first you go, well, that's horrible. It is, they are being treated disproportionately because there's only 13% of Blacks and only half of those are males. So we're really looking at 6.5% of the population, and it's 1/3 of the people that are getting killed unarmed by police. But Blacks commit over 50% of the violent crime, the murders and so forth. So in a way, they're being treated better by police. They're committing more than half of the violent crime, and then they're only 1/3 of the people that are being killed unarmed by the police. You see what I mean? So the data doesn't support that narrative. It just doesn't. Now, people might think it does because they watch TV and the mainstream media wants to push this narrative, and they're going to show examples of it, of when that happens, and not show the other examples to direct where, to mold people's thinking. Okay. All right. So certainly some people, and it's perfectly reasonable to understand why someone would write BLM in their window to keep their store from being robbed. I don't blame that guy at all. I don't want his store being destroyed either. But it is demoralizing. And when you get it done to the entire population, you've got a serious problem. So Soviet Russia used the tact to weaken the people's fortitude when they just thought that no matter what I think, it doesn't matter. I have to toe the party line, if you will. And the sad thing about it is all these false narratives are hurting the very people they're purported to help. These false narratives are supposed to be helping Black people. Please let them start being treated better by police, which would be a great thing. But actually it hurts them, because I want to give you 3 examples that shows you how they're being hurt. There was the cutest thing I've almost ever seen on TV a couple years ago. It was sad though. I mean, I saw it on the internet. It wouldn't show it on TV. There was a little Black girl about 4 years old, adorable. She had dressed, and you could tell she dressed in her prettiest dress. It was pink, beautiful. She had white socks and black patent leather shoes on. Her mom had made her hair just gorgeous, with little beads falling from every little shape that she put in her hair. Just beautiful. She's out on a plaza somewhere. I can't remember what city it was, but it was a big concrete plaza with a fountain. It was just going down at dusk. And it was a beautiful scene, really. This little girl out with her parents for a walk in this beautiful weather with beautiful clothes on. You know, you could tell she was proud of it and everything, and holding both parents' hands. So she lets go of him and goes up to a policeman and asked him if he was going to shoot them. And she's only 4 years old. Isn't that sad, really? Are you going to shoot us? That's what she said to the policeman. That's one example. Another example is when I saw a group of tadpole football players, young boys, black boys, kneeling down during the national anthem at a tadpole football game when it was being played before the game. And I used to do all that. And because there's a high percentage of single motherhood in the Black community, as you know, that coach is one of the main male authority figures for those boys, okay? And I was really mad at the coach for letting those boys kneel down like that, because it says a couple things that bother me. Number one, this country, they're citizens of this country. They're just as important a citizen as anyone else. And they should be standing and listening to the national anthem, not kneeling like they're not a member of the country, kind of. You know what I mean? That they're against the country at age 8, you know? He should have said, men, stand up when the national anthem is played. You're US citizens. Give respect to our country, you know, that kind of an attitude. It didn't happen. And then the third one is a little bit something I wouldn't normally say on TV or whatever, or YouTube, but there's a little girl that was about 4 that had F the police on her sign. Some adult had given it to her. And it's just as bad maybe for a real conservative group. Don't get me wrong. I'm neither Republican or Democrat, but I don't like it when children are indoctrinated like this, you know, and fear someone that they're supposed to grow up thinking could protect them in a bad situation, like a policeman or something. But anyway, you know, she's saying, F the police, F the police. And she had a sign. Certainly she didn't know what it meant, I'm sure, but some adult had given it to her and all that. It just bothered me, you know. I don't like indoctrination. That bothers me. I want people to be individuals, to think on their own. Certainly parents teach children all the time, but that's the wrong kind of thing to teach a child, because it's fearful. It scares them. They're scared of someone who wouldn't ever hurt them, who would help them. You know what I mean? Like a policeman and a 4-year-old girl. Okay. Now the race baiter guys add to this, in my opinion, because they want the victimhood narrative to be perpetuated, or they're out of business. You know what I mean? Kind of. So I don't like that either. This part might be a good time to stop, but if we've gone on too long for the third part. But this is where I get into a little bit of the philosophy of why it's happening. Why are we abandoning these principles of logic and belief and factual evidence, where we look at the data and make a decision and tell everyone what the data says, not force false narratives on people to benefit the very few, you know? Very sad. Would you want to stop here and do part 3, or you want me to continue?
Let's keep going.
Okay. Well, why is this happening? Why are we abandoning all this? The why part is very easy, I think. You're a lot younger than me, but when I was young, the moral compass was centered around forgiveness and a sort of a do unto others mentality that you might teach your children. You know, when someone makes a mistake, you forgive them, and, you know, so forth, and treat other people well, the way you'd like to be treated, things like that. But that's been replaced with virtue signaling, which is the practice of speaking or behaving in a way that is meant to demonstrate. That's a very important phrase, meant to demonstrate one's good character or moral superiority. You see it on social media every day. In a way, it's kind of replaced religion, and corporations have even adopted it now. virtue signaling. It's amazing. Coca-Cola and these companies are doing virtue signaling now in their ads all the time. Now, the how part really interests me because it's a little mathematical how this is happening. So let me show you the next slide. Yeah. So I'm going to do a little common sense analysis of a group of individual thinkers versus groupthink. And you'll see it. I'm going to quantify it a little bit. Because a friend of mine, when I moved over here, I had a friend from Singapore. And he said, wow, you're from America? I said, yeah. He said, that's a country of individuals. That's the way he described America. And this is 20 years ago when I first got here. And I liked the way he described America. I felt like it was a compliment. Now, have you ever noticed that large groups almost always get everything backwards? Almost always they get it completely wrong. So did you ever see a show called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Yeah.
By any chance? Okay. There were 3 things the contestant could do when he didn't know an answer. He could ask the audience. He could do this thing called 50-50 where a computer would take away 2 of the 4 possibilities and then he'd have to guess the last 2. And then there was phone a friend where he might have a smart friend that knew a lot about basketball. And the question was about basketball. So he hoped his friend knew who won the NBA championship in 1933. And they almost never know. The phone a friend is the worst thing. All right. So let's say you have a question that's very difficult and there's 130 people in the audience, okay? And they're voting in secret. You know, they look down on their little box and they push the answer. So they're not discussing it for 15 minutes or having one person give a speech or anything like that. But let's also assume that the question is so hard that only 10 people know the answer. That's 1 out of 13 people knows the answer. That's a very hard question. They'll still make the right decision every time. The audience will, okay? They will. 50-50 will make it half the time because they're going to remove 2 answers and the guy's going to guess between the other 2. So that's 50-50. And then of course, phone a friend is much less. Why is there so much wisdom in a group of individual thinkers? And I'm going to tell you why. Let's say the correct answer is C. This is very simple arithmetic, so I'm not going to get too esoteric here. Let's say the correct answer is C. The 10 people that know the answer, they're going to click C on their little box in the audience, right? When he asks the audience. There's 120 people left out of the 130 that do not know. They have no idea. So they're going to pick A, B, and D about 30 each, right? And C, because C could get picked when people don't know the answer. So the 120 will be 30 for A, 30 for B, 30 for C, and 30 for D, which equals 120. You with me? But remember, 10 of the people voted for C because they knew the answer. So C, the little bar graph they show you, is going to be 33.33% taller than the other bars. You see? A will be this, B will be the same, C will be a third higher, and then D will go down. And the contestant will choose C, and he'll be right. The audience was right. Isn't that interesting? On such a difficult question that only 1 in 13 people knew the answer, and you have a 33.33%, that's less than 8%, 1 in 13. But yet you have a 33.33% visual that's telling you C is the right answer. You see what I mean? The power of a group of individuals thinking on their own. Now, groupthink, in contrast, will choose the answer pushed by the most aggressive, threatening member, right? Groupthink, when everyone starts to think together, like in Lord of the Flies or some novel where everyone becomes savages and they beat up someone or kill them. That's groupthink. They'll get the wrong answer because they're going to be pushed into it by the most aggressive, threatening person, calling dissenters racist, xenophobes, transphobic, just like it's done in life now. And since those people that are so aggressive are almost never the most intelligent ones in the group's wrong almost every time, okay? About 63 genders. And here's a great example, because the reason I don't think this movement is going to survive is I think there's going to be a clash of virtue signalers over some issues. For a good example is, should trans women be allowed to compete against women who are XY, let's say, born girls, in sports? Now, you might think that feminists, who are one of these groups now, they didn't used to be. I was so in favor of equal opportunity when feminism started. I thought it was great because I did think women were discriminated against through history. And so when the people started with sort of the first, I want to call it the first iteration of feminism, I thought it was great. Women should be allowed to do anything they want to do. They shouldn't be disallowed or discounted because they're women. But it's going through several iterations where it's a little bit of a man-hating thing now and everything, which is too bad. It ruined a good idea that started. But anyway, that's clashing because you would think feminists would want to protect the women from men that want to become women, taking away all of their money in sports or all of their records or whatever it is. Some legitimately, they really want to become women, but their body habitus is different, even after they have the surgery. I'm a plastic surgeon. I know a lot about this. And boy, I sure would love to show you a picture or two of surgery we've done. It's incredible. But the shoulder girdle and the muscle mass and a lot of things, they do get reduced when the patients go on female hormones and everything. But there's just too many examples proving my point here. There's a lot of sort of average athletes that have had a sex change and are just destroying the record books in female sports. And I'll tell you, if I had a daughter who spent her whole life running track to try to get a scholarship to college, and a couple of boys come in there that just declare that they're girls, they don't even have to have the surgery yet, according to the social justice warriors, and they win the races at the state meet and get the scholarships. And my daughter didn't get to even go to the state meet because she lost the district meet. I'd be really upset about it. I don't think it's fair. And I know a lot of people, Martina Navratilova has taken a lot of flack. She agrees with me. Caitlyn Jenner agrees with me. It's just a little bit different, and it's not fair to girls that have devoted so much of their life to it. It's just, it's almost like putting a ringer in there, if you know what I mean. But anyway, and again, you just have to declare it. You don't have to have had the sex change yet, for example. So there's that's going on. And that's why I think there could be a real clash among different groups of social justice warriors over this. The feminists support the trans people being able to do it. Because again, they're in the postmodernist realm of philosophy where they believe that there's no objective truth and you can be whatever you say you are. And that's a problem for athletics. It's going to be a real problem because let's say that there's a good male college tennis player and he just wants some money, and it's big money, and he wants to play in the US Women's Open where the winner gets $2 million. So he can declare that he's a female, blow through the draw, and I mean win it very easily, and then take the 2 million, and then after that say, I'm a man now, or whatever he wants to do. I mean, evidently they would allow that to happen. I mean, like I say, prisoners have already been transferred to female prisons. So they certainly are going to have to let males compete with the women if they're willing to say they're a female. And a lot of them are for $2 million. I promise it's going to happen. It'd be horrible. All right. Now, here's a very sensitive topic that it's on people's minds, and it's the Chauvin-Floyd decision. Okay. Now, that decision was based to a very large degree on the medical experts that testified. And I even made a video about this. The medical experts said so many things that made no medical sense. It was incredible. There was a cardiologist on there that said that Mr. Floyd's heart was normal when he had cardiomegaly and he had 80% occlusion of the left anterior descending artery. I've just been studying this for 5 years. And 90% occlusion of his right coronary artery. And he said his heart was normal. He said it to the jury. there was a pulmonologist / physiologist who said some things that I've never heard in 30 years of being a surgeon that are as out there as some of the things he said. I don't want to litigate the trial, but if you watch the video, you'll see so many things I listed that he was completely wrong on, you know? And it almost makes you want to be a lawyer when you're sitting there watching something. And the races of the people did not matter at all to me. I don't care who was white and who was black. I just want justice to be done. And, you know, juries are lay people, and you can tell them almost anything medically if you do it in a very convincing way. You know, someone like me who doesn't speak very eloquently might be a worse witness, even though I know much more, than someone who speaks a little better, if you know what I mean, or looks more like a doctor, you know? I don't wear a white coat even at the hospital because the little children we do in Operation Kids are scared to death of white coats. They think they're going to get a shot. So I got in the habit of not wearing a white coat, for example, but just to give you the idea. But you get a guy that looks like Dr. What was the guy? Well, Marcus Welby, MD or something, and he says something, and they're going to kind of believe it. But it was just very sad to see these experts completely say things that were specious, you know, their arguments, and their facts were wrong. And let me just give you 2 quick examples of the pulmonologist. He said that when Floyd was handcuffed and one of the officers was pushing down on his wrists about 2 inches above his belt, you could see his belt in the picture. 2 inches above his belt is not pushing on the chest at all. The diaphragm goes up to the nipple in a man. It's hard to believe that the lungs are very high. They're much higher than people think. The diaphragm is domed, and if you put a chest tube in or something at the level a little bit below the male nipple, which is really high, you'll stick it through the liver. You're already in the abdomen there. You understand what I mean? So the thorax, where the lungs are, is very high. And he's pushing down by the belt in the back. That wouldn't keep someone from breathing. You follow me? And if you push on your back, no matter how hard you push, it barely moves. You know, it moves like a millimeter if you push as hard as you can. He said that pushing of the wrist and not even having the knee on the back, just having it snugged in there, certainly snugged in tight against the left chest, was equivalent to getting his left lung surgically removed. It affected his airflow so much. I mean, good Lord, that is just crazy. You know, removing your left lung is equivalent to pushing down by your belt and having someone's knee pressed into the side of his chest. So there were a lot of things like that, but he said it in a way that certainly wooed the CNN analysts and pundits. They said, "Oh, what an incredible witness!" The whole tenor of the trial has changed and all this. And I'm thinking, you got to be kidding! Everything he said made no sense. It made no physiological or medical sense. Not everything, but lots of things. At the end, there was this issue about carbon monoxide coming out of the exhaust of the police cruiser. And they had taken an arterial blood gas from Mr. Floyd when he arrived at the emergency room. The resident was a witness also that took care of him in the emergency room. And the arterial blood gas was 98%. And normal amount of carbon monoxide in your blood is 2% or so, you know? So the witness that I'm talking about said, well, obviously he didn't have a lot of carbon monoxide in him because the partial pressure of oxygen was 98%. Well, if I had been the lawyer, I'd have said, well, what is the purpose of CPR? And he'd have said, oh, that's to increase the oxygen in the blood, you know, when the patients need CPR, and to reduce the CO2. And I'll say, well, didn't he get the paramedics testified that they started giving him CPR in the ambulance, and then they parked in a parking lot and kept giving it, and then they drove to the hospital, you know, a total of 25 minutes or whatever the time was. And then I would show a graph that shows the arterial PO2 goes way up like that. So he didn't know what the arterial PO2 was when Mr. Floyd died. He was taking in the blood gas in the emergency room. You follow what I'm getting at? Mm-hmm. And so it's like he didn't even know the guy had CPR for 20 minutes on 100% oxygen, which really raises up the arterial oxygen content. You see what I mean? Plus, if you really believe that the arterial partial pressure of oxygen was 98%, then the whole narrative that I get confused on what was the prosecuting side, that he died of a heart attack because of hypoxia due to asphyxiation goes out the window. You don't die of hypoxia, low oxygen, when your oxygen saturation is 98%. You see what I mean? So either way, what he said just made no sense at all. You understand? So anyway, there were things like that all through to someone like me who really listens and is kind of listening real carefully to what they're saying as a doctor. And it's upsetting, you know, that we're living in a society now where truth and logic and all that is just being discounted, you know, just is discounted. And it's leading us down a very dangerous path. And if you were to come out and say this like I'm saying it now, you know, some people are going to say, oh, you're a racist. You're just saying that because Mr. Floyd was black and the other guy, Chauvin, was white. That's not the case at all. I don't care what color they were, but I want the logic to be correct. So things are done fairly. This blacks as victims mentality where everyone can kind of sit around and agree to accept things that aren't true is hurting black people, in my opinion. I'm taking one example now. We could do this about 25 topics. I chose this one because race relations are on everyone's mind now. And I know that people understand what I'm talking about. So I chose this racial issue to demonstrate the problem with obscurantism and postmodernism and everything. But when you indoctrinate children to believe that they're victims and they're not equal members of society because they're victims, that does them a lot of harm in their life. It really does. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Even down to getting killed by a policeman. If a young man thinks that he is going to get shot by a policeman, he's going to sock him in the face and run. Wouldn't you? Or something. He's going to fight him and try to get out of there if he really believes that he's going to be a victim. But you know, that's the very thing that gets him shot when there's a firefight and an arrest. If the young guy didn't think he was a victim, like I don't think I'm a victim of policemen, but I'll tell you, I don't like getting pulled over and paying $200 for a speeding ticket any more than anybody else. I don't care what color the policeman is. I don't like it. But when they pull me over, I do exactly what they say. And some people might say, oh, but that's because you're Hispanic or white or something, and they won't treat you like that. I say, I'm not going to give him a chance to treat me like that. I'm not going to grab for his gun. I'm not going to resist arrest. If he arrests me unfairly, fine. I'll have it out with him at the police station. So I think this false narrative, this narrative that's pushed all the time on television to separate the races and everything really hurts the people that are purported to benefit by it. And I say purported, that's a very important word. You understand what I mean? Very upsetting, especially see those little 4-year-old children. Okay, we're near the end now, I promise.
Yeah, and we need to remember that the news is not a community service. The news is a business.
That's right. It's become a propaganda-driven support of special interests, kind of, if you know what I mean.
And I actually think we can see proof of desperation because people are not tuning into the news anymore. Their numbers have come crashing down and they're at risk of going out of business. And so there's a lot of desperation happening. This craziness is, I think, just a sign that they're not going to exist in the future.
Well, that would be a good thing if they keep, you know, pushing this propaganda on everyone. That's hurting the people. Yeah. You know, it really is. It's hurting the people. So the great tragedy of this, in my opinion, is, let's say for the Black community, to be indoctrinated at a very young age that they're victims and they're not going to be given a fair chance. What happens is people like Al Sharpton, let's say, for example, I don't know Al Sharpton, he may be the sweetest guy in the world, but he certainly encourages the narrative. Someone like he has more influence on the Black culture because they believe they're victims. They've been indoctrinated that way by the TV and everything. than someone like Thomas Sowell is. Thomas Sowell is one of the most brilliant, and he's a Black economist at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He went to Harvard. He got his PhD at Chicago. He's one of my favorite people and most admired people. This man, who's 90 years old now, should be influencing the Black community about many, many, many things. In addition to economics, he's just brilliant. Larry Elder is another guy who's younger. He's a lawyer who is a little bit more active because I think he has a radio show or something. I've seen interviews with him. These are the kind of people that would be great for young Black men to aspire to, their philosophy. And yet, because of the victim narrative that gets indoctrinated into small children, they are influenced more by the race baiters, if you know what I mean. Very sad, you know? Groupthink has a first cousin, and that's called peer pressure, if you think about it. In other words, you're almost punished for thinking on your own sometimes, or saying, I'm going to vote for the other guy. And everyone gets mad at you, say in the Black community. Peer pressure is very severe in the Black community. Got a lot of Black friends, and privately to me, they'll say, I don't believe this, but I'm not going to say it out loud. You know what I mean? Because everyone will jump on me, and I'm just tired of it all, you know? And in the white community, I would say that people being overly politically correct is damaging white culture. They're afraid to speak the truth, to speak their mind, let's say. Could be true or false, but people ought to be able to speak out without political correctness limiting what they want to say. And I'm not talking about insulting someone. Sure, that's politically incorrect. That's just a lack of common decency. I'm talking about just normal debate, normal healthy debate between people. Certain things you're just not allowed to say, you know, but you should be able to, as long as you maintain common decency. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or anything. So let's end all this faux racism, identity politics. Identity politics, the idea that your race says everything about you and your gender. You know, I'm a white male, or I'm a mixed white Hispanic male, and someone's a Black male, and someone's an Asian female, and someone's a, you understand? And the people that believe in identity politics think that that defines me as something, okay? I mean, look at you. You're a mother. You're a dynamic woman with a business. You're different than other people that are the same gender and the same race as you. Everybody is different. We're all individuals. And let's reject postmodernism and get back to reason and belief in reality. You can't just, I mean, like I said, I'm a 6'3", 210-pound male. I'm not a 5'2" Asian female, even if I say I am, think I am, whatever. We got to get back to belief in reality, or we're going to go down a very dark road, you know, where horrible things happen, like burning witches at the stake and stuff. You know, it's just going to get horrible. So let me finish with another favorite person from history. This is the last slide. This is Frederick Douglass, who you know was a slave, and he became one of the greatest statesmen we've ever had, okay? And he made a great quote here. Can I read it? It says,
Yeah.
find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. Isn't that a great quote? Mm-hmm. People are quietly submitting to a lot of things now that they don't believe down deep in their heart. And that's what's going to get imposed on them for not speaking up. And that's a lot why I use some of the examples I used tonight to give real life examples of what I'm afraid is happening to society. It's going to destroy Western civilization if we allow it to continue.
Despite all this, are you hopeful that people will be able to see through this and will be able to do some corrections?
Well, I'm very hopeful that it'll happen. As far as being optimistic about it, I'm a little worried, to be honest with you. It's getting worse all the time, in my view. Now, what you said a minute ago about the so-called news networks having trouble getting viewership and losing viewership certainly ought to tell people some things. People have had enough of this, you know. They really, don't want it to continue because they can see it's a problem. For example, I don't know if you've heard about the controversies in the New York private school system for elite private schools. It's become so politically correct and so conjured up, and they're having second graders take critical race theory, and it just lots of things about identity politics, saying, well, you're a white girl, so you're this, and you're a black boy, and you're this, and you're, you know, second graders shouldn't be indoctrinated like that, in my opinion. And a lot of the parents are going ballistic. You know, they're pulling their kids out of there. They're writing op-eds for the New York Times and everything, explaining why they're taking their kids out. And it's good that they're doing that because it's gonna get out of control. I mean, do you remember there was a generation we used to joke about, the everybody gets a trophy generation. And in that generation, just participating gave you the same trophy as the winner, okay? Now, when I grew up, if I competed in a sport and I lost and didn't get a trophy, and everybody wants a trophy, right? I went home and I tried to improve my game so I could win the trophy next time. That was sort of the way I looked at things. But in that everybody gets a trophy generation, if you want to look at it philosophically, they're removing hierarchy. In other words, they're not giving a trophy to the person who scored the most points that's any different than the one that just showed up. And when you take away the hierarchy, okay, you lose your value system a little bit. You know, you don't know what's better and what's worse. And then any demagogue can have you at that point. You know, this is how a lot of the communist regimes were founded and maintained, by making everybody equal no matter what they produced. You understand what I mean? And I don't mean making sure everybody has enough to eat. Everybody's in favor of that. I'm talking about hierarchy in sports, for example. Everybody gets a trophy. That's a very, very bad policy for a child to grow up in, because they don't feel like their effort pays off. For example, if I was teaching a class of math students in 5th grade, and I gave the kids a test and all the tests come in and some of the kids got 95% and some of them got 45%. If I gave them all the same grade, it would be very bad for all of them. The top students will say, well, I don't need to study that hard anymore. I get the same grade no matter how hard I study. That's not what you want your children to do. You want them to feel like they're rewarded for their effort. But that system doesn't reward people for effort. And that bothers me. And I think we need to stop this. You know, that generation has grown up, and now a lot of them are in their 30s, early 30s, and they're kind of starting to be at the age where they're running the country, and it shows. You know.
Yeah. Well, certainly a great deal for everyone to really think about, and I think that, you know, you would encourage everyone to remember to think think independently, to remember that the experts can get it wrong, that the importance of thinking critically and not just, you know, listening to something on the news and assuming that it's truth. And remembering that the science is never settled by definition of what science is. It can't be. Science is a process. We're always learning. There's always more studies or new technology to change things. And, you know, we have to be more careful. I think hopefully that things have gotten to be such a circus, frankly, that more and more people are starting to see through all this craziness, and that some self-correction hopefully will happen. But you know, if nothing else, everyone who's listening, hopefully, you know, it's not about, you know, agreeing with every single thing that, you know, Dr. Sheftall says or anyone else. This is about awareness and having more productive discussions and finding ways to come together instead of being so divided, and finding a productive, compassionate path forward. So thank you so much for all of your time, for all the effort you put into this presentation. It's just given all of us, you know, so much to consider and think about, and hopefully more people will be, you know, bringing these topics into light for discussion and for processing, and we can all try to make the world better despite all of the craziness going on. The world is is ready to be changed into something more optimistic and loving and gracious and compassionate, and hope everyone can leave with a hopeful feeling, despite all of this difficulty. So I just really appreciate you being here. Again, I just want to remind everyone to be sure to go back and listen to part 1, because Dr. Sheftall took us through the data about what happened with the pandemic and how it ended in January, and that it wasn't because of the lockdowns, the social distancing, the masks, the timing of the vaccine, and what it can be attributed to, which is really, really important information to know about your past and be able to understand things that might happen in the future. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate your time, and hope everyone stays in tune with this discussion series, Science Unsettled. We'll continue to have more discussions and more guests. So thank you for being here.